After 35 years of fixing every mistake my family made, my reward was a leather-bound Bible, while my brother inherited $1 million estate. I stood there silent while they laughed at my misfortune, thinking they had finally won. But 3 weeks later, my phone vibrated for the 55th time. It was my brother Douglas, sobbing uncontrollably, begging me to undo what I had done. He screamed, "Richard, please do not do this," over and over again. I just looked at the screen and let it go to voicemail. By then, he had already lost everything, and he did not even know why. Before I tell you how a simple book destroyed his life, tell me in the comments if you have ever been underestimated by your own blood. Hit like and subscribe if you enjoy stories where justice is served cold. The reading of the will did not happen in a mahogany library, with a fireplace crackling in the background, like in the movies. It happened in a sterile gray conference room in downtown Seattle that smelled of stale coffee and expensive cologne. My brother Douglas sat across from me wearing a suit that cost more than my car. Next to him was his wife Pamela, who was already scrolling through interior design apps on her phone before our father's lawyer, Mr. Barnes, had even opened the file. I sat alone with my hands folded on the table, still wearing my work jacket from the hardware store. I was 68 years old, and I was tired. Not the kind of tired you get from a long day of work, but the kind of tired that settles into your bones after a lifetime of carrying people who never asked if your back hurt. Mr. Barnes cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, avoiding eye contact with me. He had been our family lawyer for decades. He knew who drove Mom to chemotherapy appointments 3 times a week. He knew who patched the roof during the storm of '98. He knew who paid off Douglas's gambling debts quietly so Dad would not have a heart attack. But the law does not care about moral debts. It only cares about what is written on paper. Mr. Barnes began to read in a monotone voice that seemed to suck the air out of the room. To my youngest son, Douglas Caldwell, I leave the family estate located on Queen Anne Hill, including all furnishings and personal effects. I also leave the vintage 1970 Mercedes convertible and the entirety of my liquid savings account, totaling $50,000. I watched Douglas. He did not cry. He did not look somber. A slow, satisfied smirk spread across his face. He squeezed Pamela's hand, and she let out a small squeal of delight that she tried to disguise as a cough. That house was worth $990,000 in the current market. It was the crown jewel of our family, built by our grandfather. Douglas had just become a millionaire in less than 30 seconds. Mr. Barnes paused. He looked at me, then looked down at the paper again. His hands were shaking slightly. To my eldest son, Richard Caldwell, I leave the family Bible that has sat on the mantelpiece for 40 years. It is my hope that within its pages he finds the peace that material wealth cannot provide. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. That was it. No money. No share of the house. No sentimental keepsakes other than a book. 35 years of loyalty. 35 years of being the responsible one. All valued at 0. Douglas let out a breath he had been holding. He turned to me, and the fake sympathy in his eyes was worse than if he had just slapped me. He said, "Rick, I know this is a shock, but you have to understand where Mom and Dad were coming from. They were practical people." Pamela chimed in immediately, her voice sharp and fast. She said, "Absolutely, Richard. Look at your life. You are single, you live simply, you have your pension from the engineering firm. Douglas and I have a lifestyle to maintain. We have social obligations. The house needs young energy. We are already planning to knock down that awful kitchen wall to install a granite island. It is going to cost a fortune, but it is necessary." I looked at her. She was talking about demolishing the kitchen my mother loved, while my mother's body was barely cold in the ground. I felt a burning sensation in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. I asked Mr. Barnes if that was everything. He nodded slowly and handed me a heavy rectangular object wrapped in brown paper. It was the Bible. It felt like a brick in my hands, a heavy, useless brick. I stood up. I did not scream. I did not flip the table. I simply took the book and walked out of the room. I could hear them whispering behind me. I heard Douglas say he took it better than I thought. I heard Pamela giggle and say maybe he finally realized he does not deserve anything. The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt like a descent into hell. My mind was racing. I replayed every memory. Every time I fixed the plumbing. Every time I loaned them money that was never paid back. Why had my parents done this? Was I not the good son? Was I not the one who was always there? When I reached my 20-year-old Ford truck, Douglas and Pamela were just walking out of the building. They were laughing. Douglas was swinging his car keys around his finger. He saw me and his face shifted back to that mask of patronizing pity. He walked over to me while Pamela stood by their car, checking her makeup in the side mirror. Douglas put a hand on my shoulder. I flinched, but I did not pull away. He said, "Rick, look, I do not want there to be hard feelings. Mom and Dad loved you, but they knew you. You are soft. You have always been too sentimental. They were afraid that if they gave you the house, you would just let it rot, because you would be afraid to change anything. They knew I would take the asset and maximize its value. That is just business, Rick. It is not personal." I looked him in the eye. My voice was steady but cold. I asked him if it was business when I paid for his rehab in 2005. I asked him if it was business when I rewired the entire house so it would pass inspection last year, saving them $20,000. I asked him if Dad knew that the only reason the house was still standing was because I reinforced the foundation myself 10 years ago. Douglas laughed, a dry, dismissive laugh. He shook his head. He said, "There you go again, Rick. Living in the past, always keeping score. That is why you are alone. That is why Dad left the future to me. Because I look forward. You look backward." Pamela walked over, clicking her heels on the concrete. She wrapped her arm around Douglas's waist and looked at me with pure disdain. She said honestly, "Chard, you should be grateful. You have been living in the attic apartment of that house for 10 years. Do you know what the rent is for a studio in Queen Anne? We checked on Zillow. It is at least $1,800 a month. We did the math. You saved over $200,000 in rent living off Mommy and Daddy. Consider that your inheritance. We are practically square." The audacity took my breath away. I had lived in the attic because Mom needed night care and they refused to hire a nurse. I lived there to change oxygen tanks at 3 in the morning. I lived there to carry Dad up the stairs when his knees gave out. I paid for my own groceries. I paid for the utilities. And now they were charging me retroactive rent for my servitude. I opened my truck door. I tossed the Bible onto the passenger seat. I said, "Enjoy the house, Douglas. Just remember what I told you about the drainage system on the north side. If you do not clear those pipes every month, the basement floods." Pamela laughed. She said, "Oh God, Douglas, do not listen to him. He is just trying to scare us so we will need him. We are going to hire professionals, Richard. Real contractors, not some retired old man with a tool belt. We are going to modernize everything." Douglas smirked. He said, "She is right, Rick. Don't worry about us. You just worry about reading your book. Maybe you will find some comfort in there. Oh, and Rick, one more thing." I paused with my hand on the ignition key. Douglas said Pamela wants to turn the attic into a yoga studio. We need the space, duh. The lawyers said we have to give you reasonable notice. So consider this your notice. You have 72 hours to get your junk out. We have contractors coming on Monday. 72 hours. 3 days to erase 10 years of my life. 3 days to find a place to live in one of the most expensive cities in America on a fixed income. I did not say a word. I started my engine. The old truck sputtered to life, coughing black smoke. Douglas waved his hand in front of his face in disgust. I backed out and drove up the ramp into the Seattle rain. The wipers slapped back and forth against the glass like a metronome counting down the seconds of my old life. I drove back to the house that was no longer mine. It loomed large and dark against the gray sky, a Victorian beauty with intricate woodwork that I had sanded and painted with my own hands. I parked on the street because Douglas had parked his car in the driveway earlier, blocking the garage. I walked up the steps that I had built. I unlocked the front door with a key that would soon be useless. Inside, the house smelled like Mom's lavender potpourri and Dad's pipe tobacco. But the atmosphere had changed. It felt hostile. It felt like the house itself knew I was trespassing. I walked up the narrow stairs to the attic. My space. It was small, but it was mine. A twin bed, a desk, a bookshelf filled with engineering manuals and history books. I found a roll of heavy-duty garbage bags under the sink. I started packing. I did not pack carefully. I threw my clothes in. I threw my books in. I took the framed photo of me and Dad fishing from my dresser. I looked at it for a moment. Dad was smiling, holding a big salmon. I was looking at Dad with adoration. I smashed the glass against the side of the trash can and let the photo fall into the darkness. I worked through the night. I could hear Douglas and Pamela downstairs later that evening. They had come over to celebrate. I heard champagne corks popping. I heard loud music. I heard them talking about which walls to knock down. They were dissecting the house like a carcass. The next morning, I was carrying the last bag down the stairs. My back screamed in protest, but I refused to show weakness. Douglas was in the kitchen nursing a hangover, drinking coffee out of my favorite mug. He saw me and pointed to the door. He said, "Good, you are early. Leave the keys on the counter. And Rick, do not take anything that belongs to the house. I counted the silverware yesterday, so do not get any ideas." I put the keys on the granite counter with a click. I looked at him one last time. He looked bloated and arrogant. A man who thought he had hit a home run, but was actually standing on third base thinking he hit a triple. I said, "Douglas, listen to me very carefully. The retaining wall behind the garage is compromised. I was going to reinforce it next month. If you dig or bring heavy machinery into the backyard, before fixing that wall, the whole slope could slide. Do not ignore this." Douglas laughed. He poured more coffee and didn't even look at me. He said, "Spare me the lecture, Rick. You are just jealous because I am going to build a pool there. A pool, Rick. Something you could never afford. Now get out. You are depressing me." I picked up my bag. I picked up the Bible. I walked to the front door. I opened it, and the cold wind hit my face. I stepped out onto the porch. I did not look back. I did not slam the door. I closed it gently with a soft click. That sound was the final period at the end of a very long sentence. I threw my bags into the back of my truck. The rain was coming down harder now, washing away the grime on the sidewalk, but it could not wash away the anger that was solidifying in my gut like concrete. I got into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment. I looked at the Bible on the seat next to me. My father's handwriting was on the inside cover. To Richard. My rock. I scoffed. A rock is something you step on to get to higher ground. That is what I had been. A stepping stone. I drove away from the house on Queen Anne Hill. I drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city near the airport. The room smelled of cigarettes and despair. I threw my bags on the floor and sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. I had nothing. No home. No family. Just a truck full of old clothes and a book I didn't want. I picked up the Bible, intending to throw it into the trash can by the TV. I raised my arm ready to pitch it. But as I held it up, the book fell open. It did not fall open to a random page. It fell open to the back. And that was when I saw it. The back cover felt thick, thicker than it should be, and along the seam of the binding, the leather was peeling slightly. I frowned. My father was a perfectionist. He never let his books get damaged. I looked closer. It wasn't damage. It was a cut. A deliberate, precise surgical cut made with a razor blade. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. I sat down. I pulled a small pocket knife from my keychain. My hands were trembling. I slid the blade into the slit in the leather. I sliced it open. There was no money inside. My stomach dropped. I had foolishly hoped for a stash of cash. But then I saw something glinting in the harsh light of the motel lamp. It was a key. A small silver key with a number stamped on it. 402. And wrapped around the key was a piece of notebook paper folded into a tiny square. I unfolded the paper. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was shaky and jagged, written in the last days before the morphine took over Dad's mind. But it was legible. It read, "Richard. If you are reading this, it means Douglas took the house. I knew he would. I knew he would throw you out. He has his mother's greed and my blindness. I failed him by spoiling him. But I will not fail you." I stopped breathing. I read the next line. "The will you heard today was a test I prayed Douglas would pass, but knew he would fail. He inherited the house, Richard. That is true. He owns the wood, the glass, and the brick. But look at the deed. Look at the land trust documents in safety deposit box 402 at First National Bank." My eyes raced to the bottom of the page. Douglas owns the house. But 20 years ago, I separated the title. You own the land, Richard. You own the ground beneath his feet, and the 99-year ground lease expires 2 days after my funeral. I stared at the paper. The sound of the rain outside faded away. The anger in my gut didn't disappear, but it changed. It cooled. It hardened into something sharp and deadly. I was not homeless. I was the landlord, and my tenant was about to violate his lease. I looked at the cheap motel phone. I knew who I had to call. Not Douglas, not Pamela. I picked up the receiver and dialed the number for Leonard Katz, the meanest real estate litigation attorney in the state of Washington. The game had just changed, and Douglas had no idea he was already in checkmate. The neon sign outside the motel window flickered with a buzzing sound that felt like a drill boring into my skull. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner, a scent that tried to cover up years of regret but failed miserably. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the stained beige carpet. This was my life now, a $60 a night room on the edge of the highway. While my brother and his wife were likely popping another bottle of champagne in the kitchen I had tiled with my own hands. I looked at the bag of clothes I had hastily thrown together, and sitting on top of it, mocking me in the harsh yellow light of the bedside lamp, was the Bible. The inheritance. The insult. I felt a surge of rage so hot it made my skin prickle. For 35 years I had been the rock. I had been the one who sacrificed marriage, travel, and a career to stay close, to fix the roof, to manage the medical bills, and my reward was a leather-bound book, while Douglas, who couldn't even change a light bulb without calling a handyman, got the $1 million estate. I stood up, my knees cracking. I grabbed the heavy book. It felt cold and dead in my hands. I walked toward the metal trash can by the desk. I wanted to hear it hit the bottom. I wanted to be done with the Caldwell legacy. I wanted to erase the memory of my father's weak smile and my mother's silent complicity. They had played me for a fool. I raised the book high over the bin. My arm trembled. I took a breath, ready to let go, but I couldn't do it. Call it habit. Call it the ghost of the man who taught me to respect craftsmanship, even if he didn't respect me. I lowered my arm. I felt pathetic. I couldn't even throw a tantrum properly. I walked back to the bed and sat down, the springs groaning under my weight. I decided I would look at it one last time. Just once. Then I would leave it here on the nightstand for the maid to find. I let the book fall open on my lap. The pages were thin and crinkled, smelling of old paper and history. It fell open to the New Testament. I went to close it, but a flash of blue ink caught my eye. I froze. My father never wrote in books. He said it was disrespectful. But there, in the margin of the Gospel of Matthew, was an arrow drawn in blue ballpoint pen. The ink looked fresh, not faded like the dedication on the front page. It pointed directly to verse 6:21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I stared at the words. Treasure. What a sick joke. My treasure was currently being measured for a yoga studio by my sister-in-law. I felt the anger rising again, choking me. I slammed the book shut. The sound was a dull thud, but as my thumb pressed against the back cover to hold it closed, I felt something. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. But I spent 40 years as a structural engineer and a carpenter. My hands knew when a surface wasn't true. My fingers knew when wood was warped or when a wall wasn't plumb. The back cover of the Bible was too thick, and there was a ridge, a small, hard lump hidden beneath the leather binding, right near the spine. I ran my fingers over it again. The leather on the inside cover had a seam that looked just a little too perfect. Glue. Someone had peeled this back and glued it down again. My heart started to hammer against my ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old Swiss Army knife. I unfolded the small blade. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, but the curiosity was stronger than the piety. I slid the blade under the edge of the leather lining. It gave way with a soft, tearing sound. I peeled back the thick paper. There was no cash inside. My stomach dropped for a second. I had foolishly hoped for a stack of $100 bills, something to get me out of this hellhole. Instead, there was a cutout in the cardboard stiffener of the cover, a hollow space carved with surgical precision. Resting inside that hollow space was a key. It was small, silver, and flat. It wasn't a house key. It was stamped with a number, 402, and the logo of First National Bank, a safety deposit box key. Underneath the key was a piece of notebook paper, folded into a square the size of a postage stamp. I picked it up, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy. I unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, jagged, written by a hand that was losing its battle with tremors. It was my father's writing from his last days. It read, Richard, if you are reading this, it means Douglas kicked you out. I prayed he wouldn't. I prayed he would share. But I know my son. He sees the house as a pile of money. You see the foundation. I stopped breathing. The noise of the highway outside faded into nothingness. The note continued. The will was a test of character. He inherited the house, Richard. That is true. He owns the structure, the wood, the glass, the brick. But look at the deed. Look at the land trust documents in box 402. I squinted at the last line, reading it twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from the stress. Douglas owns the house, but 20 years ago, I separated the title. You own the land, Richard. You own the ground beneath his feet, and the 99-year ground lease expires 48 hours after my funeral. I lowered the paper. I looked at the key in my palm. It felt cold, but it made my blood run hot. The despair that had been crushing my chest 5 minutes ago evaporated. I looked around the dirty motel room, but I didn't see the stains or the peeling wallpaper anymore. I saw a war room. I was not a victim. I was the landlord, and my tenant had just violated his lease in the most spectacular way possible. I checked the time on my phone. The bank opened in 9 hours. I placed the key carefully in my shirt pocket, right over my heart. Then I picked up the Bible and placed it gently on the nightstand. I wasn't going to throw it away. I was going to keep it. After all, it had just given me the only thing I needed. I lay back on the hard pillow and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel tired. I felt wide awake. Let Douglas and Pamela have their party tonight. Let them toast to their new wealth. Let them plan their renovations, because tomorrow morning I was going to introduce them to the reality of real estate law. And it was going to hurt a lot more than a slap in the face. The automatic glass doors of First National Bank slid open with a soft hiss that sounded like a snake taking a breath. I stepped onto the polished marble floor, shaking the rain off my coat. The air inside was cool and smelled of money and floor wax. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. While Douglas was likely just waking up in the master bedroom of the house he thought he owned. I was standing here with the only key that mattered. I approached the desk. A woman with glasses and a name tag that read Ms. Reynolds looked up. I told her I needed to access safety deposit box 402. She did not ask about my clothes or my tired eyes. She simply asked for my identification and the key. When I slid the small silver key across the granite counter, she checked her computer and nodded. She led me back to the vault. It was a heavy steel room that felt like a bunker. The wall was a grid of brass rectangles. She used her master key, I used mine, and together we turned them. The lock clicked. A sound so solid and final it echoed in my chest. She pulled the long metal box out and carried it to a private viewing room. She set it on the table and closed the door, leaving me alone with the silence. I sat down. My hands were steady now. The adrenaline from last night had settled into a cold, hard determination. I lifted the lid of the metal box. There was no gold. There were no stacks of cash bound in rubber bands. There was only a thick, expandable file folder made of brown cardboard. On the front of the file, in my father's distinct block lettering, written with a black marker, were the words, "The Caldwell Land Trust." I untied the string that held the flap closed. I pulled out a stack of documents that must have been 3 inches thick. The paper was heavy bond legal paper, the kind lawyers use for important filings. On top was a letter. It was not a short note like the one in the Bible. This was 3 pages long, written on his personal stationery. I recognized the date. It was written 6 months ago, right after the doctor told him the cancer had spread to his liver. I began to read. My dearest Richard, if you are holding this letter, it means that my worst fears have been realized. It means that Douglas has acted exactly as I predicted he would. It means he has taken the house and cast you aside without a second thought for your years of sacrifice. I paused. I had to look up at the ceiling to blink back the sudden sting in my eyes. Dad knew. He had watched. All those years I thought he was oblivious to Douglas's selfishness. All those years I thought he was just spoiling the baby of the family. He had actually been taking notes. I looked back at the letter. You always wondered why I never confronted Douglas. You wondered why I paid his debts and let him pretend to be successful. It was because I knew that confrontation would not change him. Douglas is a man who only learns when he hits the bottom, and I could not bear to be the one to push him there while I was alive. But I cannot leave you unprotected when I am gone. I turned the page. The will Mr. Barnes read yesterday was technically valid, but it was incomplete. It transferred ownership of the structure located at 2400 Queen Anne Avenue to Douglas. The structure, Richard, the house, the garage, the physical materials, the wood, the glass, the shingles. But 20 years ago, when I refinanced the property to pay for your mother's first surgery, I made a change to the title that nobody noticed. I placed the land itself, the earth, the soil, the very ground the house sits on, into a separate legal entity called the Caldwell Land Trust. I picked up the legal document beneath the letter. There it was. A deed of trust. It clearly stated that the land was the sole property of the trust. And looking at the beneficiary page, I saw my name, Richard Caldwell, sole beneficiary. I went back to the letter. In the state of Washington and in real estate law, generally, the owner of the land has superior rights. The house is merely an improvement on the land. For the last 20 years, the house has existed on the land subject to a 99-year ground lease. I flipped through the stack until I found the document titled Ground Lease Agreement. It was thick, dense, with legal jargon about easements and liability. I scanned the pages until I found the termination clause. My father had circled it in red ink. My heart stopped. The clause read, "This lease shall automatically terminate at midnight on the date of the death of the grantor Ernest Caldwell, without the need for further notice. Upon termination, the owner of the improvements, meaning the house, must either remove said improvements from the land at their own expense within 30 days, or forfeit ownership of said improvements to the land trust." I set the paper down. My hands were shaking again, but this time it was not from nerves. It was from the sheer magnitude of what my father had done. He had not just given me the land. He had given me a loaded gun. The house that Douglas was currently celebrating, the house he was planning to renovate, the house he was using as collateral for his loans, did not have a legal right to exist on my property. Technically, as of 3 days ago, Douglas was trespassing. Every brick, every board, every nail of that Victorian mansion was sitting on my dirt without a lease. I read the final paragraph of the letter. "I know you, Richard. You are kind. You are forgiving. You will be tempted to show this to Douglas immediately to warn him. Do not. Let him show his true colors. Let him prove whether he is a brother or a leech. If he treats you with respect, you have the power to sign a new lease. You can let him stay for $1 a year if you choose. But if he treats you as disposable, then you must use this. You must teach him the lesson I was too weak to teach him. You are the rock, Richard. But even a rock can crush if it falls from a high enough place. I love you, son. I am sorry I waited so long to give you this power." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my inside jacket pocket next to my heart. I looked at the legal documents spread out on the table. The deed, the trust, the expired lease. I thought about the conversation in the parking lot yesterday. I thought about Pamela laughing about charging me back rent. I thought about Douglas telling me not to steal the silverware. They were worried about forks and spoons while I held the title to the earth beneath their feet. I put everything back into the file folder. I tied the string with a deliberate, slow knot. I stood up and walked out of the viewing room. Ms. Reynolds looked up as I approached the counter to return the box. She asked if I found what I was looking for. I looked at her, and for the first time in days, a genuine smile touched my lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who just realized the war was over before the enemy even knew the first shot had been fired. I said, "Yes, ma'am." I found exactly what I needed. I walked out of the bank into the gray Seattle morning. The rain had stopped. I took a deep breath. The air didn't smell like exhaust and despair anymore. It smelled like justice. I pulled out my phone. I had one call to make. Not to Douglas. He didn't deserve a warning. I dialed the number for Leonard Katz. He was expensive, he was ruthless, and he was exactly the kind of shark I needed to swim in these waters. When his receptionist answered, I didn't ask for an appointment. I told her to tell Mr. Katz that I was the new trustee of the Caldwell Land Trust, and I needed to initiate eviction proceedings against a squatter on my property. I hung up and walked to my truck. I wasn't going to the construction site today. I wasn't going to look for a new apartment. I was going to sit back and watch my brother build his castle on quicksand. He wanted to play the big shot. He wanted to talk about assets and liabilities. Well, he was about to learn the most important rule of real estate. Location is everything. and unfortunately for him, his location belonged to me. Leonard Katz's office was not in a glass skyscraper with a view of the Space Needle. It was in a squat, brick building in Pioneer Square that had survived 2 earthquakes and 3 riots. The elevator smelled of brass polish and old cigars. When I walked into his suite, there was no receptionist with a headset. There was just a wall of filing cabinets and a door that was slightly ajar. I knocked, and a voice that sounded like gravel crunching under tires told me to come in. Leonard Katz sat behind a desk that was buried under an avalanche of legal briefs. He was a small man with wild white hair and eyes that looked like they had seen every possible way a human being could lie. He didn't look up when I entered. He just held out a hand waiting for the file. I placed the documents from the safety deposit box into his palm. He adjusted his thick glasses and began to read. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the heavy ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the rustle of paper. I sat in a leather chair that had cracked with age and watched him. My father had told me once that Leonard Katz was the only lawyer in Seattle who could make a bank president cry. Looking at the intense focus on his face, I believed it. Finally, he stopped reading. He didn't look at me immediately. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Then he let out a low whistle that turned into a dry, rasping laugh. He looked at me and said, "Mr. Caldwell, your father was a son of a bitch. But my God, he was a genius." I asked him if the documents were solid. I needed to know if there were any loopholes Douglas could use to wiggle out of this. Katz leaned forward, resting his elbows on the files. He looked at me with a predatory grin. He said, "Solid is not the word I would use. This is ironclad. This is nuclear. You see, in the state of Washington, we have very specific laws regarding property rights. Most people own their property in what we call fee simple. That means they own the house, the dirt, and the air above it. But your father severed that bundle of rights 20 years ago." He pulled out the deed and tapped it with a yellow, stained finger. He continued explaining that Douglas holds the title to the improvements. That is the legal term for the house, the garage, and the driveway. But you, Richard, you hold the title to the parcel, the land. And under the terms of this ground lease, which expired 48 hours ago, Douglas is currently occupying your land without a valid contract. I asked him what that meant in practical terms. Katz sat back and laced his fingers together. He said it means you have him by the throat. In real estate law, the land is the dominant estate. The house is servient. Think of it like a car parked in a parking spot. Douglas owns the car. You own the parking spot. And the meter just ran out. You have the right to call the tow truck. He reached for a legal pad and picked up a pen. He said I can have an eviction notice served by this afternoon. We will file an unlawful detainer action. We will give him 30 days to either negotiate a new lease at a market rate that we determine or remove his property from your land. And since he cannot physically pick up a Victorian mansion and move it, he will be forced to forfeit the structure to you. It is brutal, it is efficient, and it is entirely legal. I watched him start to draft the notice. I saw the excitement in his eyes. He was a shark smelling blood in the water. He wanted to strike now while the wound was fresh, but I raised my hand. I told him to stop. Katz looked at me confused. He asked why I would want to wait. He said every day Douglas stays there is a day he is living in your house for free. I shook my head. I told him that Douglas wasn't just living there. He was planning. I stood up and walked to the window looking out at the rainy street below. I told Katz about the conversation in the parking lot. I told him about the kitchen renovation. I told him about the granite island and the new appliances. I told him about Pamela's plans to turn the attic into a yoga studio with hardwood floors and skylights. I turned back to Katz. I said Douglas just took out a massive loan against the house. He has hundreds of thousands of dollars in credit that he is about to pour into that property. He is going to fix the plumbing. He is going to upgrade the electrical panel. He is going to install a new roof. Katz's eyes widened. He dropped his pen. The realization hit him, and his grin returned wider than before. He said, "I see. You want to let him improve the asset." I nodded slowly. I said, "Exactly. If we evict him today, I get an old house with a cracked foundation and bad pipes. A house that I have to pay to fix. But if we wait, if we let him play the big shot for a few weeks, he will do all the work for me. He will spend every dime of his inheritance and every dime the bank will lend him to increase the value of my property." Katz chuckled, shaking his head in admiration. He said, "That is cold, Mr. Caldwell. That is ice cold. You are going to let your brother bankrupt himself, renovating a house he doesn't actually own." I sat back down and looked Katz in the eye. I didn't feel cold. I felt logical. I told him that for 35 years, Douglas had taken everything without asking. He took my parents' attention. He took their money. He took the credit for my work. Now he was going to give something back. He was going to give me a fully renovated estate. It was only fair. I told Katz to prepare the paperwork but not to file it yet. We would wait. We would wait until the sawdust settled. We would wait until the marble countertops were installed. We would wait until Douglas was sitting in his brand new kitchen thinking he was the king of the world. And then we would serve him. Katz closed the file folder. He looked at me with a new level of respect. He wasn't looking at a victim anymore. He was looking at a client who understood the game. He asked me what I was going to do in the meantime. He asked where I was staying. I told him I was in a motel near the airport. It didn't matter. I could sleep on a park bench knowing what I knew now. I told him I would keep my head down. I would let them think I was defeated. I would let them think I was gone. Katz stood up and extended his hand. His grip was firm. He said, "Richard, I have been doing this for 40 years. I have seen families tear each other apart for pennies. But I have never seen a strategy this disciplined. Your father was right to leave the land to you. Douglas thinks he is playing checkers. You are playing three-dimensional chess." I shook his hand and walked to the door. Before I left, I turned back. I asked Katz one more thing. I asked him if the bank would check the title before giving Douglas the construction loan. Katz shrugged. He said usually they would. But if Douglas is using a private lender or a line of credit based on the tax assessment, they might miss the land trust separation. It is a rare legal structure, and honestly, banks are greedy. They see $1 million house and they want to lend money. They won't look too closely at the dirt until it is too late. I nodded. That was all I needed to hear. I walked out of the office and back into the rain. But this time, the rain didn't feel depressing. It felt like it was washing the slate clean. I got into my truck and drove past a hardware store. I saw people loading lumber and paint into their cars. I thought about Douglas and Pamela right now, probably arguing over paint swatches, probably yelling at contractors, probably spending money they didn't really have. Let them build. Let them dream. I drove back to the motel. I had a lot of waiting to do, but I was good at waiting. I had waited 35 years for my turn. I could wait a few more weeks. I sat on the motel bed and opened the Bible again. I didn't look for hidden keys this time. I just read the verse my father had marked. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Douglas's treasure was in that house. His heart was in that house. His ego was in that house. And when I took it away, I wouldn't just be taking a building. I would be taking his soul. I closed the book and turned off the lamp. For the first time since the funeral, I slept soundly. I slept like a baby. I slept like a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. The following weeks were a masterclass in human greed and the willful blindness of banking institutions. I watched it unfold with the patience of a sniper waiting for a clear shot. It started on a Tuesday, a day that should have been unremarkable. But for Douglas Caldwell, It was the day he signed his financial death warrant. I was parked down the street in my battered Ford truck, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos. I had made a habit of watching the house, not stalking, just observing. I needed to know exactly how deep the hole was before I started filling it with dirt. I watched a courier van pull up to the driveway. A man in a uniform hopped out with a thick envelope. Douglas met him at the door. I could see the grin on my brother's face from 50 yards away. It was the grin of a man who thinks he has cheated the system. That envelope contained the loan documents. As Leonard Katz had predicted, the bank had been sloppy. They saw a property appraised at nearly $1 million, owned free and clear by a previous generation, and they saw a new heir with a decent credit score and a hunger for cash. They didn't pull the full title history. They didn't check the land records deeply enough to see that the house was effectively a floating castle with no ground beneath it. They just saw the asset and approved a home equity line of credit for $200,000. $200,000. To a man like Douglas, who had spent his life living paycheck to paycheck while trying to look like a millionaire, that money was not a loan. It was a lottery win. It was validation. The spending began less than 24 hours later. I was at the hardware store buying some washers for a faucet in my motel room when I heard the roar of an engine that didn't belong in the parking lot. It was a low, throaty growl that vibrated in your chest. I turned to look out the front window. A Porsche 911, silver as a bullet, and just as dangerous in the wrong hands, swerved into 2 parking spaces. Douglas stepped out. He was wearing sunglasses, even though it was overcast. He wore a leather jacket that looked stiff and brand new. He didn't walk, he strutted. He looked around the parking lot as if expecting applause. I pulled my cap down low and stayed in the plumbing aisle, watching through the gaps in the shelves. He didn't come in to buy tools. He came in to buy a high-end grill, the kind that costs $3,000 and has more dials than a cockpit. He pointed at it, handed a black card to the cashier, and snapped his fingers at a stock boy to load it up. He was burning through the money. But a grill was just the appetizer. 3 days later, I found a reason to stop by the house. I told myself I needed to pick up some mail that hadn't been forwarded yet. But the truth was I needed to document the carnage. I pulled into the driveway. The Porsche was parked front and center, blocking the path to the front door, gleaming aggressively in the rain. I walked up the steps. The front door was unlocked. I knocked and pushed it open. The house was unrecognizable, not because they had renovated it yet, but because it was filled with boxes. High-end shopping bags from Nordstrom, Gucci, and Williams-Sonoma were scattered across the living room floor like debris from an explosion in a luxury mall. Pamela was in the center of the room, holding up a pair of silk curtains that probably cost more than my truck. She looked at me and her face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, look, Douglas," she called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "The ghost of Christmas past has returned." Douglas walked in from the kitchen. He was holding a glass of scotch. It was 2 in the afternoon. He saw me and took a slow sip, savoring the power dynamic. "What do you want, Rick?" he asked. "We are busy." "I just came for my mail," I said, keeping my voice low and humble. I gestured to the room. "It looks like you came into some money." Douglas laughed. He walked over to the Porsche key fob lying on the mantelpiece and spun it on the wood. It made a scratching sound that made me wince, but it was his mantelpiece now. Or so he thought. "It is called leverage, Rick," he said, lecturing me like I was a child. "You use the asset to generate liquidity. The house was just sitting here, dead capital. I woke it up. We got a line of credit. 200 grand. I widened my eyes, feigning shock. 200,000? Douglas, that is a lot of debt. The interest rates are rising. Are you sure you can make the payments? Pamela snorted. She threw the curtains onto the sofa. Oh, stop it, Richard. You sound just like your father. Scared of your own shadow. Douglas is investing. We are going to upgrade this place, flip it in a year or two, and walk away with double what it is worth. You have to spend money to make money. Not that you would know anything about that. I looked at the pile of boxes. I saw a new flat-screen TV, the biggest size available. I saw designer handbags. I saw a case of expensive wine. Is this the investment? I asked, pointing to a pair of Italian loafers sticking out of a box. Douglas stepped into my personal space. He smelled of scotch and expensive cologne, but underneath it, I could smell the fear, the faint, metallic scent of a man who knows he is in over his head, but is swimming faster to pretend he isn't drowning. We are celebrating, Rick, he said, poking me in the chest with a finger. We deserve this. I took care of Mom and Dad in my own way. I dealt with their expectations. I dealt with their pressure. Now it is my turn. And frankly, having your old beaten-up truck in my driveway is ruining the aesthetic. Get your mail and get out. I walked to the hallway table. My mail was there, thrown into a careless pile. Bills, mostly. A few junk flyers. But buried in the stack was something else. I saw the edge of an envelope from the bank addressed to Douglas. It had been opened and discarded. I palmed it quickly, sliding it into my jacket pocket along with my own letters. I knew what it was. It was the confirmation of the loan terms. I needed the account number. I needed the exact dates. I turned back to them. Douglas had returned to the window and was admiring his Porsche. Pamela was tearing open another box. They had forgotten I was there before I had even left the room. I am worried about you, Doug, I said. It was the only honest thing I said that day. I wasn't worried about his finances. I was worried about his soul. He was digging a grave so deep he would never climb out. He didn't turn around. Just go, Rick. Go back to your motel. Leave the big decisions to the men who know how to handle them. I walked out. I walked past the Porsche. I ran my hand along the hood. It was cold and sleek. It was a beautiful machine. It was also the most expensive paperweight in history. I got into my truck and drove a few blocks away before pulling over. I opened the stolen envelope. My hands were shaking slightly. There it was. The loan amount, $210,000. The interest rate was variable, starting high and destined to go higher, and the collateral was listed clearly. 2400 Queen Anne Avenue. I took a picture of the document with my phone and sent it to Leonard Katz. Then I typed a simple message. He took the bait. The hook is set. I sat there for a moment, listening to the rain drum on the roof of the cab. I thought about the $3,000 grill. I thought about the silk curtains. I thought about the way Douglas had poked me in the chest. They were spending money that wasn't theirs, secured by a house that wasn't theirs, on land that belonged to me. Every dollar they spent on luxury goods was a dollar they wouldn't have when the eviction notice landed. Every dollar they put into the renovation was a donation to my future estate. I should have felt guilty. I should have felt like a bad brother. But then I remembered the Bible. I remembered the 35 years of silence. I remembered the smirk on Pamela's face when she told me to be grateful for the attic. They wanted to play the part of the rich, successful heirs. Fine. I would let them play. I would let them buy the costumes and the props. I would let them build the stage. And when the curtain finally rose, I would be the one waiting in the wings to turn off the lights. I started the truck. I had one more stop to make. I needed to go to the city planning office. If Douglas was going to start knocking down walls, he would need permits. And knowing my brother, he probably thought permits were for little people. If he started construction without them, that would be another violation of the ground lease, another nail in the coffin. I drove through the wet streets of Seattle, a ghost in a machine, invisible and dangerous. Douglas had his Porsche. He had his scotch. He had his pride. But I had the patience of a man who had already lost everything and found something much more valuable in the wreckage. I had the truth. And the truth was about to become very expensive for Douglas Caldwell. The rain in Seattle does not wash things away, it just makes the dirt harder to see. But inside the house on Queen Anne Hill, the dirt was piling up fast. It had been 2 weeks since Douglas bought the Porsche, and the high of spending, borrowed money was wearing off, replaced by the itch to destroy something. Pamela had decided that the layout of the Victorian home was too closed off. She wanted an open concept. She used words like flow and energy while pointing at walls that had stood for 100 years, holding up the second floor. I knew what was coming. I had seen the contractor vans parked out front. But these were not the vans of reputable companies. There were no logos on the side, no license numbers painted on the doors. These were beat-up white vans with rust around the wheel wells, the kind that belong to guys who work for cash under the table and disappear when the building inspector shows up. Pamela had hired the lowest bidder. I found out later that she had gotten a quote from a legitimate structural firm for $20,000 to remove the wall between the kitchen and the dining room. They had told her it was a load-bearing wall requiring steel beams and temporary supports. Pamela had laughed at them. She told Douglas that contractors were just trying to rip them off. She found a guy on an app who said he could do it for $3,000 in 2 days. I was sitting in a diner 3 blocks away, nursing a black coffee and reading the local paper when my phone rang. It was Douglas. I let it ring 3 times. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted him to hear the silence on the line and wonder if I was ever going to pick up. When I finally answered, I didn't say hello. I just listened. "Rick, you need to get over here. Now." His voice was an octave higher than usual. It was the voice of the little boy who had just thrown a baseball through the neighbor's window. I asked him what was wrong. I kept my voice calm, almost bored. "Just come over. It is the house." There was a noise, a loud noise, and now the door to the master bedroom won't close. I told him I was busy. I told him I had things to do. "Rick, please." The guys left. They just packed up their tools and ran. "I don't know what to do. Pamela is freaking out." I smiled. The guys ran. Of course they ran. That is what unlicensed labor does when gravity takes over. I told him I would be there in 10 minutes. I paid for my coffee, leaving a generous tip for the waitress. I walked to my truck, whistling a tune I hadn't thought of in years. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked normal from the outside. The paint was still peeling slightly, the way it always had. The Porsche was parked in its usual spot, gleaming under the gray sky. But as soon as I walked through the front door, I could feel it. The air inside was thick with drywall dust. It hung in the air like a fog, coating everything in a fine white powder. The expensive silk curtains Pamela had bought were gray with dust. The new flat-screen TV was covered in it. I walked into the kitchen. It looked like a war zone. A massive section of the wall was gone hacked away with sledgehammers and sawzalls. Debris was piled high on the floor. Exposed wires hung from the ceiling like severed nerves. But my eyes went straight to the ceiling. A crack, a jagged black line about half an inch wide, started at the corner of the dining room and zigzagged its way across the plaster all the way to the hallway. It looked like a bolt of lightning frozen in stone. Douglas was standing in the middle of the rubble wearing his expensive leather jacket, which was now dusted white. He was pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair. Pamela was sitting on a cooler in the corner, crying. Not the silent, dignified crying of someone in grief, but the angry, hysterical sobbing of a child who broke her toy. Douglas saw me and rushed over. He grabbed my arm. His grip was desperate. "Rick, thank God. Look at this. Those idiots just started swinging hammers, and then there was this crack. A sound like a gunshot. And now the ceiling looks like it is sagging." I shook his arm off and stepped into the center of the room. I looked up. I didn't need a tape measure to know what had happened. They had removed the main support studs without installing a header. The entire weight of the second floor, the master bedroom, the bathroom, the heavy clawfoot tub was now resting on nothing but air and faith. The house was slowly settling. If they didn't shore it up soon, the ceiling would come down. I looked at the floor. The hardwood was buckling slightly under the pressure. "You cut the load-bearing wall, Doug," I said quietly. "I told you about this wall 10 years ago. Remember when we remodeled the pantry? I told you this beam holds up the house." Douglas waved his hand dismissively. "I don't know about beams, Rick. That is your department. Pamela said we needed light. She said the guys knew what they were doing." I looked at Pamela. She wiped her eyes, smearing mascara across her cheek. She pointed a finger at me. "Don't you look at me like that, Richard. They said it was fine. They said it was just partition framing. You are supposed to be the expert. Why didn't you warn us?" The audacity was breathtaking. I had lived in this house for 35 years. I had kept it standing, and now she was blaming me for her budget renovation disaster. I turned back to Douglas. "So what do you want me to do?" Douglas let out a nervous laugh. "Well, fix it. You have your truck right. You have your jacks and your lumber. We need to prop it up. Put in that beam thing you talked about. I will help you. We can knock it out this afternoon." I stared at him. He actually thought this was a weekend project. He thought he could snap his fingers, and I would put on my tool belt and save him just like I always did. He thought my labor was free. He thought my expertise was his birthright. I looked at the crack again. It had grown wider in the 5 minutes I had been standing there. Dust was trickling down from it in a steady stream. "I can't help you, Doug," I said. Douglas froze. His smile faltered. "What do you mean you can't?" "You are a structural engineer. This is what you do," I corrected him. "This is what I used to do before I retired, before I was kicked out of my home. Besides, I don't have my tools anymore." This was a lie. My tools were in the truck, but he didn't check. Douglas's face turned red. He stepped closer, getting into my face. "Don't give me that crap, Rick. This isn't a game. The house is falling down, Mom and Dad's house. You can't just let it collapse out of spite." I looked around the room at the mess they had made, at the cheap renovation that had compromised the integrity of the structure. "This isn't Mom and Dad's house anymore, Doug," I said coldly. "It is your house. You inherited it, remember? You wanted the asset. You wanted the control. Well, this is part of ownership. Sometimes the roof caves in." Pamela stood up, kicking a piece of drywall across the floor. "You are despicable," she screamed. "You are doing this on purpose. You are jealous because we are making the house better. Because we have vision and you have nothing." I looked at her calmly. "Better. You hired unlicensed hacks to save a few $1,000s so you could buy handbags. You compromised the structural integrity of a building that has survived earthquakes because you wanted an open concept for your parties. That isn't vision, Pamela. That is vanity." Douglas slammed his hand against the counter. "Enough! Rick, just fix it. I will pay you okay. Is that what you want? You want money? Fine. I will give you $500. Just go get your jacks. $500. To install a structural steel beam that required a crew of 3 and a crane. To save $1 million asset." He was still trying to rip me off even when he was begging. I laughed. It was a harsh, dry sound. "I don't want your money, Doug. And I am not going to fix it. You need a licensed contractor. You need a permit. And you need to pray that the city inspector doesn't drive by and see the dumpster in the driveway. Because once he sees this, he will red tag the building and you will have to move out until it is brought up to code." Douglas looked terrified at the mention of the inspector. He grabbed my shirt. "You have to help me, Rick. We can't afford a big contractor. We spent the cash on the materials and the other things. We are tight right now until the flip. Just do this for me. For family." I looked down at his hand gripping my cheap flannel shirt. I reached up and peeled his fingers off one by one. Family, I repeated. Family is the people you invite to dinner, not just the people you call when the toilet backs up or the roof caves in. You told me to leave Doug. You gave me 3 days. You told me all I deserved was a Bible. I took a step back toward the door. I am just the guy with the Bible, Doug. I don't know anything about beams. I am just a simple old man reading scripture. You are the real estate mogul. You figure it out. Douglas's fear turned into rage. It exploded out of him. You useless old failure, he screamed, his spit flying. You are enjoying this, aren't you? You want us to fail. You are nothing, Rick. You have always been nothing. That is why Dad left the house to me, because he knew you were weak. He knew you were petty. Get out. Get the hell out of my house. Oh. I stopped at the door. I turned back one last time. Careful with that yelling, Doug, I said softly. The vibration might bring the rest of the ceiling down. I walked out. I heard him screaming curses behind me. I heard Pamela throwing something that shattered against the wall. I got into my truck. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally saying no. I started the engine and pulled away. I drove a few blocks and pulled over. I took a deep breath. I felt light. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of that house on my shoulders. It was Douglas's weight now, literally. I pulled out my phone and called Leonard Katz. It is worse than we thought, I told him. They compromised a load-bearing wall. The house is structurally unsound. Katz swore softly on the other end of the line. Does this change the plan, Richard? Do we need to intervene before the asset is destroyed? I watched the rain hitting the windshield. I thought about the crack in the ceiling. I knew the house. I knew the bones of it. It wouldn't collapse today. It would settle. It would groan. But it would stand long enough for Douglas to bleed. No, I said. It will hold. But he is going to have to spend a fortune to fix it. He is going to have to dip into the emergency funds. He is going to have to max out the credit cards. He has no choice. If he doesn't fix it, he loses the certificate of occupancy. Let him fix it, Katz. Let him pay the emergency rates for a structural crew. Let him bury himself in debt to repair the damage he caused. And when he is done, when the check has cleared and the wall is strong, then we take it back. Katz laughed. You are a dangerous man, Richard. I hung up. I wasn't dangerous. I was just tired of being the safety net. Douglas wanted to fly high. He was about to learn that when you fly without a net, the ground is very hard and very unforgiving. And the ground belonged to me. The silence that fell over the house on Queen Anne Hill was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a stopped heart. The banging of hammers had ceased. The white vans with the rusted wheel wells had stopped coming. The structural crack in the ceiling remained, a jagged scar that Douglas had hastily covered with a layer of spackle and a fresh coat of paint. It was like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg, but that was Douglas's entire philosophy on life. If you can't see the problem, it doesn't exist. I continued my vigil from down the street. I watched the mailman deliver stack after stack of envelopes with red urgent stamps. The high-interest loan on the Porsche, the credit card bills for the silk curtains and the $3,000 grill, and now the demand letters from the structural engineering firms he had called and then ghosted when he heard their prices. Douglas was drowning. I could see it in the way he walked to the mailbox. He didn't strut anymore. He slouched. He would snatch the mail, look around nervously to see if anyone was watching, and then scurry back inside like a rat, carrying a piece of cheese that was too heavy for it. Then came the pivot. I knew it was coming because men like Douglas only have 2 gears: greed and flight. He had tried greed. He had tried to turn the house into a palace for himself. That had failed. Now he was shifting into flight mode. On a Thursday morning, a real estate agent's sign appeared on the front lawn. It wasn't just any sign. It was a massive, sleek placard from a luxury brokerage featuring a photo of a woman with perfect teeth and a blazer that cost more than my annual pension. For sale. Asking price $1.5 million. I sat in my truck and stared at the number. 1.5 million. The audacity was staggering. He was selling a house with a compromised foundation, a house with a load-bearing wall missing a house that was technically trespassing on my land, and he was asking for a king's ransom. I called Leonard Katz immediately. "He is selling," I said. "The sign just went up." Katz laughed a low rumble that sounded like distant thunder. "He is fast, I will give him that. He knows he can't afford to fix it, so he is trying to dump the liability on someone else." I asked Katz if we should stop him now. "Not yet," Katz said. "Let him find a buyer. Let him sign a contract. Let him accept a deposit. The moment he takes money for a property, he doesn't have the legal right to sell. He crosses the line from civil dispute to criminal fraud. We want him to cross that line, Richard. We want him to sprint across it." So I waited. And because the Seattle housing market is a beast that defies logic, I didn't have to wait long. The open house was a spectacle. Douglas and Pamela had staged the home beautifully. They had moved furniture to hide the sloping floor where the wall had been removed. They had placed vases of fresh flowers to cover the smell of damp drywall. They had turned on every light to distract from the dark corners where the truth was hiding. I parked down the block and watched the parade of luxury cars. Teslas, Mercedes, BMWs, people desperate to buy a piece of history. They walked in seeing the fresh paint and the granite countertops. They didn't see the rot. They didn't see the legal landmine buried under the floorboards. Douglas was in his element. I saw him through the front window holding a glass of wine, charming a young couple. He was pointing at the view. He was laughing. He looked like the lord of the manor. It was his greatest performance. 3 days later, the sold pending inspection sticker was slapped across the sign. I found out the details through a friend of a friend who worked at the brokerage. The buyer was a tech executive from California. He wanted the house for the location. He had offered full asking price, cash. And because he wanted to close quickly, he had agreed to a shortened inspection period. But the most important detail was the earnest money, the deposit. In a deal this size, the deposit was substantial, $50,000. $50,000 to show good faith. $50,000 that was supposed to sit in an escrow account until closing. But Douglas, being Douglas, had negotiated a release of the funds. He had spun some story about needing to pay off a lien to clear the title quickly. The buyer, eager to secure the property, had agreed. $50,000 was wired directly into Douglas's personal account on a Friday afternoon. I expected him to pay off the Porsche. I expected him to pay the credit cards. I expected him to just maybe hire a structural engineer to patch the house so it wouldn't collapse on the new owners. I was wrong. On Saturday morning, a taxi pulled up to the house. Douglas and Pamela emerged dragging 2 massive suitcases. They were wearing sunglasses and resort wear. Pamela had a wide-brimmed straw hat. Douglas was wearing a floral shirt that looked ridiculous in the Seattle drizzle. They were laughing. They looked like 2 people who had just pulled off the heist of the century. They threw their bags into the taxi and sped off toward the airport. I followed them. Not all the way to the terminal, but far enough to confirm their direction. Then I checked Pamela's social media. She couldn't help herself. She had to brag. 5 minutes later, a photo appeared on her Instagram. A picture of 2 first-class tickets to Cabo San Lucas. The caption read, "Finally, some well-deserved relaxation before our next big adventure, #sold, #millionaire life, #buy Seattle." I sat in my truck and stared at the phone. They had taken the deposit money. The money that wasn't theirs. The money for a house they didn't own on land they didn't lease, and they were going to blow it on margaritas and massages in Mexico. They had left the house broken. They had left the debts unpaid. And they had fled the country, believing that when they returned in a week, the rest of the 1.5 million would be waiting for them. I felt a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It wasn't anger anymore. It was disgust. They were not just greedy. They were careless. They treated people and laws and commitments as inconveniences to be ignored. I called Leonard Katz. "They are gone," I said. "They are in the air. Cabo." And they took the deposit with them. Katz was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was deadly serious. "Richard," he said, "this is it. He has accepted funds for a sale he cannot complete. He has converted trust funds for personal use. And the moment the title company pulls the file on Monday morning, the entire house of cards is going to collapse." I asked him what the next move was. Katz said, "Enjoy your weekend, Richard, because on Monday at 9 a.m. we are going to drop the hammer. By the time Douglas lands in Cabo, he might still think he is rich. But by the time he orders his first drink, the title company will be calling him. The real estate agents will be calling him. And the bank will be calling him." I hung up. I looked at the empty house. The for sale sign was still there, standing crooked in the wind. The sold sticker was peeling slightly at the corner. I started my truck. I drove back to my motel room. I had $50 left in my checking account. My brother had $50,000 in his pocket and was flying first class. But I slept better than he did. Because I knew something he didn't. I knew that Monday was coming. And Monday was going to be a very bad day for the Caldwells. I spent the weekend cleaning my tools. I sharpened my chisels. I oiled my saws. I prepared my mind. I read the Bible not for comfort, but for focus. I read about the foolish man who built his house on sand. And I thought about Douglas building his life on lies. Sunday night I packed my bag. I was ready to leave the motel. I knew I wouldn't be staying there much longer. The lease was up. The game was up. When Monday morning broke, the sky was clear. A rare sunny day in Seattle. The kind of day that exposes everything. The kind of day where you can't hide the cracks in the walls or the cracks in your soul. I drove to the title company's office. I didn't go inside. I just parked across the street and waited for Leonard Katz to arrive. He pulled up in his vintage Lincoln, a shark in a shark's car. He carried a briefcase that contained the land trust deed, the expired lease, and the eviction notice. He nodded at me as he walked into the building. I checked the time. It was 9 o'clock. In Cabo, it was noon. Douglas was probably sitting by a pool right now, holding a drink with an umbrella in it, thinking he had won. Thinking he was the smartest man in the room. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. I could almost hear the phone ringing in Mexico. I could almost hear the ringtone cutting through the sound of the ocean. 1 ring. 2 rings. "Pick up, Doug. Pick up." The reality check is calling. The conference room at Purely Title and Escrow was located on the 42nd floor of the Columbia Tower. From the window, you could see the entire city of Seattle spread out like a gray quilt. You could see the ferries cutting across the Puget Sound. You could see the Space Needle. And if you looked hard enough toward the north, you could see Queen Anne Hill, where a Victorian house sat on a piece of land that was about to become the most controversial patch of dirt in the state. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. I was not there as a guest. I was there as an interested party. Leonard Katz sat next to me. He had his briefcase open and his hands folded on top of a stack of files. He looked like a funeral director waiting for the body to arrive. Across from us sat the buyer. His name was Mr. Sterling. He was a tech executive in his 30s wearing a hoodie that probably cost $500. He looked impatient. He was tapping a gold pen against the table, checking his watch every 30 seconds. Next to him was his real estate agent, a woman who looked nervous. She kept glancing at Katz. She knew who he was. In the real estate world, seeing Leonard Katz at a closing table is like seeing the Grim Reaper at a birthday party. At the head of the table sat the escrow officer, a man named Mr. Henderson. He looked pale. He had a file open in front of him, and he was sweating. "All right," Mr. Henderson said, his voice trembling slightly. "We have the sellers on the line." He pressed a button on the speakerphone in the center of the table. The line crackled, and then the sound of mariachi music and ocean waves filled the tense silence of the room. "Douglas, are you there?" My brother's voice boomed through the speaker. It was loud, confident, and slurring slightly. He had clearly started celebrating early. "We are here, Mr. Henderson. Pamela is just ordering another round of margaritas. How is the weather in Seattle? Still raining, I bet. We are ready to sign electronically. Just send the DocuSign link and wire the funds. We have a dinner reservation at Nobility tonight, and I plan on buying the most expensive bottle of tequila they have." Mr. Sterling stopped tapping his pen. He leaned toward the phone. "This is Sterling. Look, Douglas, I have a meeting in an hour. Let's just get this done. I assume the title is clear." Douglas laughed. "Clear as a bell, Sterling. You are getting a gem. A real gem. Just wire the money. 1.45 million, right? That is the balance after the deposit." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Mr. Caldwell, I am afraid we cannot proceed with the closing today. In fact, I am afraid we cannot proceed at all." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. The mariachi music seemed to fade away. "What do you mean you can't proceed?" Douglas snapped. "The money is there. The inspection period is waived. What is the problem?" Mr. Henderson looked at Katz, then back at the phone. "Sir, during the final title search this morning, a cloud appeared on the title. A very significant cloud. It appears that while you hold the deed to the structure known as the residence, you do not hold the deed to the land it sits on." I could hear Douglas breathing. It was a heavy, ragged sound. "That is ridiculous," he sputtered. "It is my parents' house. I inherited it. I have the will." Mr. Barnes read it. "Yes," Mr. Henderson said patiently. "You inherited the improvements, but the land is held by a separate entity called the Caldwell Land Trust, and we have received a formal notice from the trustee regarding the ground lease." "Who is the trustee?" Douglas shouted. "I don't know what you are talking about. Who is trying to sabotage my sale?" Leonard Katz leaned forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Hello, Douglas. This is Leonard Katz." There was a gasp on the other end of the line. Douglas knew the name. Everyone in our family knew the name. Katz had represented our father's business interests for 30 years. Katz. "What are you doing there?" "I am representing the beneficiary of the Caldwell Land Trust," Katz said smoothly. "As of last week, the 99-year ground lease for the property at 2400 Queen Anne Avenue expired. The trust has decided not to renew the lease with you, Douglas." "Not renew," Douglas screamed. "What does that mean?" Katz smiled a cold, shark-like smile. "It means, Douglas, that you have 30 days to remove your personal property from the land. And since your personal property is a 3-story Victorian mansion attached to a concrete foundation that is going to be physically impossible. Therefore, under the terms of the original deed of trust, ownership of the structure will revert to the landowner." The buyer, Mr. Sterling, stood up. His face was red. "Wait a minute," he said, looking at Henderson. "Are you telling me that if I buy this house, I don't own the land under it, and the guy who owns the land wants to kick the house off?" "That is exactly what I am telling you," Sir Henderson said. "The title is uninsurable. We cannot close." Sterling turned to the speakerphone. "Douglas, you lying snake. You told me you owned it free and clear. You took my $50,000 deposit." Douglas was panicking now. His voice rose to a shriek. "Sterling, listen to me. This is a mistake. A clerical error. I will fix it. I will call the trustee. Who is the beneficiary, Katz? Who is doing this? Is it some developer? Is it the city? Tell me who I have to pay off." Katz looked at me. I hadn't said a word. I had just sat there listening to my brother unravel. I nodded at Katz, giving him permission to drop the final hammer. "The sole beneficiary of the Caldwell Land Trust is Mr. Richard Caldwell," Katz said. The silence this time lasted for 10 seconds. It was heavy. It was suffocating. Rick Douglas whispered. His voice was broken. "Rick, is that you?" I leaned toward the speakerphone. "Hello, Douglas," I said. "I hope the weather in Cabo is nice." "Rick, please," Douglas stammered. "Please tell them this is a joke. Tell them you are signing the lease." "I spent the money, Rick. I spent the deposit. I can't pay it back. If this deal doesn't go through, I go to jail." I leaned back in my chair. "I recall you telling me that you were the businessman, Douglas. You told me to read my Bible. Well, I did, and I followed the instructions in the back of the book." Sterling slammed his hand on the table. "I don't care about your family drama," Sterling yelled. "I want my $50,000 back, Douglas. Today. If that money is not in my account by 5 p.m., I am filing fraud charges with the FBI. Do you hear me?" Fraud. Douglas was crying now. I could hear Pamela screaming in the background, asking what was happening. "Rick, help me," Douglas sobbed. "You can't do this. I am your brother. You gave me 3 days to move out." "Douglas," I said calmly, "the law gives you 30. I think that is very generous." I signaled to Katz. He closed his briefcase. "The closing is canceled, Mr. Henderson," Katz said. "We will be filing the eviction notice with the court this afternoon." "Good day, gentlemen." We stood up and walked out. Behind us, the speakerphone was still active. We could hear Douglas begging. We could hear Sterling shouting threats. We could hear the sound of a life collapsing in real time. We walked to the elevator in silence. When the doors closed, Katz looked at me. "That was brutal," he said. "It was necessary," I replied. We rode down to the lobby. I walked out into the street. The sun was still shining. I felt a strange sense of peace. I had not raised my voice. I had not thrown a punch. I had simply allowed the truth to exist. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I knew who it was. It was Douglas. I didn't look at it. He was trapped in a foreign country, with no money, a furious buyer on his heels, and a brother who had finally learned how to say no. I walked to my truck. I had one more stop to make. I needed to go back to the house. My house. I wanted to sit on the porch and watch the sunset. I wanted to see what it felt like to be home. As I drove, I thought about the $50,000 Douglas had stolen and spent. That was not my problem. That was a matter for the police. My problem had been solved. The house was safe. The legacy was safe. And as for Douglas, well, he always wanted to travel. He was about to go on a very long journey through the legal system. I hoped he packed enough resilience because where he was going, money couldn't save him. Only the truth could. And he ran out of truth a long time ago. The flight back from Cabo San Lucas must have been the longest 4 hours of Douglas's life. I was not on the plane, but I could imagine it vividly. He was trapped in a metal tube at 30,000 feet, with no Wi-Fi to check his bank accounts, and a wife who was already looking at him with the cold calculation of a forensic accountant. When they landed at SeaTac Airport, the reality of their situation did not just greet them, it tackled them. As soon as Douglas turned off airplane mode, his phone vibrated so hard it nearly fell out of his hand. It was not a text message. It was a notification from his banking app. A Account frozen. Contact your branch immediately. They took a taxi home because Uber would not accept his credit card. The card had been declined for the first time in his life. I was parked down the street when the taxi dropped them off. I saw Douglas arguing with the driver, trying to pay with cash he had scraped together from his pockets. It was a humiliating spectacle. The great real estate mogul haggling over a $40 fare. But the real show was waiting for them, Jameson, on the front porch. Taped to the front door, right next to the peeling for sale sign, was a thick envelope. It was not a greeting card. It was a process server's delivery. Douglas ripped it open, standing there in the rain with his suitcase. I used my binoculars to see his face. It went pale. It was the lawsuit from Mr. Sterling. The buyer was not bluffing. The document was a civil complaint for fraud, breach of contract, and conversion of funds. Sterling was not just asking for his $50,000 deposit back. He was suing for damages. He was demanding double the amount, plus legal fees. $100,000, payable immediately. Douglas dropped the papers on the wet porch. He looked at Pamela, but she was already walking past him, unlocking the front door. She did not stop to pick up the lawsuit. She stepped over it like it was trash. They went inside. I imagined the conversation. Douglas trying to spin it, trying to say it was just a misunderstanding, that he would fix it. But you cannot spin an avalanche. You just get buried. An hour later, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. It was not the police. It was worse. It was a representative from the bank. The man who stepped out was wearing a cheap suit and holding a clipboard. He walked up to the house and pounded on the door. I rolled down my window slightly to hear. Douglas opened the door. He looked disheveled. He was still wearing his floral vacation shirt, but now it looked like a clown costume. Mr. Caldwell, the bank representative, said loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "We have been trying to reach you. Your loan is in default." Douglas tried to hush him. "Look, I can explain. There is a title issue. I am working on it." The representative shook his head. "There is no title issue, sir. There is fraud. You secured a line of credit using collateral you did not possess. That is a federal crime. The bank has invoked the acceleration clause. The entire balance of $210,000 is due immediately." Douglas laughed, a hysterical, high-pitched sound. "I don't have $200,000. I spent it. I improved the asset." The representative looked at the Porsche parked in the driveway, the silver 911 that Douglas loved more than he loved his own brother. "We are aware of your spending, sir," the man said. "Since you cannot repay the liquid funds, we are exercising our right to seize all purchased assets to recoup our losses." He signaled to a tow truck that had been idling around the corner. It roared to life. Its yellow lights flashed, reflecting off the wet pavement. It backed into the driveway. Douglas ran out in his socks. "No, you can't take the car. That is my car. I put $10,000 down on that." The repo man didn't even look at him. He hopped out, hooked the chains to the undercarriage of the Porsche, and started the winch. The beautiful German engineering groaned as it was dragged backward. The tires skidded on the asphalt, leaving black marks that looked like desperate claw marks. Douglas stood there in the rain, screaming. He grabbed the door handle of the car, as if he could hold it back with his bare hands. The bank representative simply wrote something on his clipboard and handed Douglas another piece of paper. "This is a notice of intent to seize personal property inside the home," the man said. "Television, appliances, furniture. Anything purchased with the loan proceeds is now property of the bank. We will be back tomorrow with a moving truck." The tow truck drove away, dragging Douglas's ego with it. The Porsche turned the corner and vanished. The bank representative got into his sedan and left. Douglas was left standing alone in the driveway. He was wet. He was broke. And he was about to lose the only thing he had left. He walked back into the house. I waited. I knew the final act of this tragedy was coming. I knew Pamela. I knew her ambition. She was a woman who hitched her wagon to a star, but the moment the star started falling, she would cut the rope. 30 minutes later, the front door opened again. This time it was not Douglas. It was Pamela. She was not wearing her vacation clothes. She was dressed in a sharp business suit. She was dragging 2 large Louis Vuitton suitcases, not the ones with clothes. These were the ones she used for her valuables. Douglas ran out after her. He was crying. He was grabbing at her arm. "Pam, where are you going? You can't leave. We have to figure this out. We are a team." Pamela stopped. She spun around, and her face was a mask of pure disgust. She didn't scream. She didn't yell. She spoke with a cold, deadly precision that carried through the damp air. "We are not a team, Douglas. We were a merger. And you are bankrupt." Douglas fell to his knees on the porch. "But I bought you everything. The car, the clothes, the jewelry." Pamela adjusted her coat. She tapped the suitcase she was holding. "I am keeping the jewelry, Douglas. Consider it severance pay for wasting 5 years of my life. I pawned the engagement ring an hour ago. It paid for my first-class ticket to my mother's house in Phoenix." She reached into her purse and pulled out a white envelope. She threw it at him. It landed in a puddle. "Those are the divorce papers," she said. "My lawyer will be in touch. Do not call me. Do not come find me. If you do, I will testify against you in the fraud case." She walked down the steps. A taxi was waiting for her. She got in without looking back. Douglas stayed on his knees. He watched the taxi drive away. He watched his wife leave. He watched his life dissolve. He picked up the wet envelope. He held it to his chest and let out a scream that sounded like an animal caught in a trap. It was a scream of pure agony. It was the sound of a man realizing that he was not the hero of his own story. He was the villain, and the movie was ending. I sat in my truck and watched him. I took a sip of my coffee. It was cold, but it tasted good. I should have felt pity. He was my little brother. I had changed his diapers. I had taught him to ride a bike. I had protected him from bullies. But he had become the bully. And the only way to stop a bully is to let him punch a brick wall and break his hand. Douglas stood up slowly. He looked old. He looked like an old man in a young man's clothes. He turned and walked back into the empty house. The house with the cracked ceiling. The house with the missing wall. The house that sat on my land. I started my engine. I had seen enough. The house of cards had fallen. The king was dethroned. The queen had fled. I drove to the nearest post office. I had one final letter to send. It was the official eviction notice. The 30-day clock had started. Douglas had 30 days to remove his improvements from my land. But we both knew he couldn't move the house. And he couldn't fix it. And he certainly couldn't sell it. He was trapped. He was living in a prison of his own making. And the warden was his boring older brother with a Bible and a pickup truck. I drove back to my motel room. I packed my bag. I wouldn't need to stay there much longer. In 30 days, I would be going home. But before that, I knew the phone would ring. I knew Douglas would call. He had run out of options. He had run out of allies. He had run out of lies. He would call me. He would beg. He would use the word family like a weapon. And I would be ready. I would answer the phone. And I would tell him exactly what he told me on that rainy Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago. I would tell him that this was just business. I lay down on the bed and closed my eyes. I could hear the rain stopping outside. The storm was over for me. But for Douglas Caldwell, the hurricane was just making landfall. The vibration of a cell phone on a cheap wooden nightstand is a sound I will never forget. It started as a low hum, a persistent buzzing that rattled the glass of water I had placed next to the lamp. I was back in my motel room, sitting in the same sagging armchair where I had discovered the key in the Bible. But the room felt different now. It didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a control tower. I had placed my phone face down. I didn't want to see his name. I didn't want to see the picture of us fishing in Idaho that popped up every time he called. I just wanted to listen. I wanted to hear the raw, unedited soundtrack of a man realizing that gravity is not a negotiation. The first 10 calls came in a rapid-fire burst right after we left the title company. These were the anger calls. I let them go to voicemail one by one, sipping my black coffee and watching the rain streak against the window. When the little red icon showed that I had new messages, I pressed play on the speakerphone. The first voice message was an explosion of noise. I could hear the wind of the street outside the Columbia Tower. "Richard, pick up the damn phone. Who do you think you are walking out of there like that? You embarrassed me in front of Sterling. You embarrassed me in front of the bank. Call me back right now and tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you are signing the lease extension. If you don't, I swear to God I will sue you for everything you have. I will take your pension. I will take your truck. I will bury you." I took a sip of coffee. The threat was empty. He couldn't sue me. He didn't even have the filing fee for a small claims case anymore. The next few messages were variations on the same theme. Threats. Insults. He called me jealous. He called me a bitter old man. He called me a thief for stealing his inheritance. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. He was accusing me of stealing the thing he had tried to steal from me. Then around call number 20, the tone shifted. The anger began to crack, revealing the panic underneath. This was the bargaining phase. This was Douglas realizing that threats were useless against a man who had nothing to lose. "Rick, listen to me." "I am sorry," I yelled. "I am just stressed." "The bank froze the accounts, Rick. All of them. Even the joint account with Pamela. They took the Porsche. They literally dragged it out of the driveway while the neighbors watched. It is humiliating. Look, we can work this out. I know I was harsh giving you 3 days to move. That was wrong. I admit it. How about we split the sale proceeds? You sign the lease, we close the deal with Sterling, and I give you 20%. That is $300,000, Rick. Think about it. You can buy a nice condo. You can travel. Just call me back." I didn't reach for the phone. 20%. He was still trying to buy me off with crumbs from a loaf of bread that belonged to me. He still thought this was about money. He didn't understand that I didn't want a condo. I wanted my home. By the 30th call, the background noise had changed. He wasn't on the street anymore. He was inside somewhere with an echo. Maybe the airport terminal. Maybe an empty hallway in the house he no longer owned. "Rick, it is me again. Why aren't you answering? Sterling is going crazy. His lawyer just emailed me a draft of a civil complaint. They are using words like fraud and embezzlement. They are talking about jail time, Rick. Federal prison. You can't let your little brother go to prison. Mom would never forgive you. Remember when I broke the neighbor's window and you took the blame? Remember when I crashed Dad's car and you fixed it before he got home? You always fix it, Rick. Please, I will give you 50%. Half. We split it down the middle. Just save me." I closed my eyes. The memories he was invoking were designed to hurt. He was weaponizing my love for him. He was using my history of kindness as ammunition. Yes, I remembered taking the blame. I remembered fixing the car, and I remembered that he never said thank you, not once. He just assumed that my purpose in life was to be his shield. But a shield gets dented. A shield gets heavy. And eventually, the soldier puts the shield down. Around call number 40, the bargaining stopped. The reality of Pamela's departure must have hit him. The silence on the other end of the line before he spoke was chilling. "She left me, Rick. Pamela is gone. She packed her bags and took a taxi. She took the jewelry. She took the cash we had in the safe. She threw divorce papers at me in the mud. I am all alone here. The house is dark. The power company just cut the electricity. I am sitting in the dark in a house that is falling apart. It is cold. I don't have anywhere to go. My credit cards are declined. I can't even buy food. His voice broke. It wasn't a scream anymore. It was a sob. A deep guttural sound that tore at my heart. I have nothing, Rick, nothing. I am 60 years old, and I have nothing. How did this happen? I was on top of the world this morning. I was in Cabo. I was rich. How did you do this? Why did you do this? I sat there in my motel room listening to my brother cry. I looked at the Bible on the nightstand. I thought about the verse, "For where your treasure is there, your heart will be also." Douglas's treasure was money. It was status. It was the admiration of strangers. And when those things were stripped away, he was hollow. He had no foundation. I poured another cup of coffee. My hand was steady, but my chest felt tight. This was justice. I knew it was justice. But justice is a bitter medicine. It cures the disease, but it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. The calls kept coming. 45, 50, 52. They became incoherent, rambling monologues about our childhood, about a dog we used to have, about the time we built a treehouse. He was regressing. He was a scared child, calling out for his big brother to come and turn on the lights. "Rick, are you there? I know you are listening. I know you are there. Please pick up. Just tell me what to do. I will do anything. I will sign the house over to you. I will work for you. I will sleep in the attic. I don't care. Just don't leave me like this. The silence is killing me. The house is making noises, Rick. The crack in the ceiling is getting bigger. I can hear it groaning. It hates me. The house hates me." I looked at the clock. It was almost midnight. He had been calling for 12 hours. The phone vibrated one last time. Call number 55. I hesitated. My finger hovered over the answer button. I could end this. I could pick up and tell him to meet me at the diner. I could write him a check for $1,000 and tell him to find a hotel. I could be the savior one last time. But then I looked at my hands. They were rough hands, workers' hands, hands that had built and repaired and sustained. And I thought about his hands. Soft, manicured, hands that only knew how to take. If I saved him now, he would never learn. If I pulled him out of the fire, he would just strike another match the moment my back was turned. He needed to burn. He needed to turn to ash so that something real could grow. I let the phone ring. 1, 2, 3, 4. The voicemail clicked on. Rick. His voice was a whisper now. Resigned. Dead. I get it. You aren't coming. You are really done. Dad was right. He left you the Bible because he knew you were the only one strong enough to follow the rules. I never read the rules, Rick. I just tried to win the game. And now I have lost. I am going to sleep in the truck tonight. If the repo man doesn't come back for the other car. Goodbye, Rick. The line went dead. I sat in the silence of the motel room. The buzzing had stopped. The insect was dead. I finished my coffee. It was cold. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain had stopped and the city lights were reflecting off the wet pavement. Somewhere out there in the dark, my brother was sleeping in a cold truck parked in the driveway of a mansion he couldn't enter on land he didn't own. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a heavy, solemn resolve. This was the cost of setting things right. The demolition phase was over. The structure had been brought down to the studs. Tomorrow, the rebuilding would begin. But not for Douglas. Tomorrow is for me. I picked up the phone and turned it off completely. I didn't want to hear call number 56. There was nothing left to say. The message had been delivered loud and clear. I walked to the bed and pulled back the covers. I placed the Bible on the pillow next to me. It was the only companion I needed tonight. I slept. And for the first time in 35 years, I didn't dream about fixing someone else's mess. I dreamed about planting a garden in the backyard of my house, a garden with deep roots that no storm could ever wash away. The diner was located 3 miles from the county courthouse, a place where people went to celebrate small victories or mourn total defeats. It smelled of burnt bacon and stale cigarette smoke that clung to the vinyl booths despite the no-smoking signs. It was neutral ground, a place where high society didn't dare to tread. I arrived 5 minutes early. I wanted to be seated before he walked in. I wanted to watch him enter not as the confident heir, but as the man he had truly become. I ordered a black coffee and waited. At 10 o'clock sharp, the bell above the door jingled. I almost didn't recognize him. Douglas stood in the doorway blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights. He was wearing the same floral shirt he had worn to Cabo, but now it was wrinkled and stained with sweat. He hadn't shaved in 4 days. His eyes were red-rimmed and darting around the room with the paranoia of a hunted animal. He looked 20 years older than he had just a month ago. He spotted me in the back booth. His shoulders slumped. He walked toward me not with the strut of a real estate mogul, but with the shuffle of a man whose knees were about to give out. He slid into the booth opposite me. He didn't say hello. He just reached for the glass of water on the table and drank it in one long, desperate gulp. His hands were shaking so badly that water spilled down his chin onto his expensive, ruined shirt. I signaled the waitress. 2 number 4 specials, I said. And keep the coffee coming. Douglas looked up at me. His eyes were watery. I am not hungry, Rick, he whispered. I haven't eaten in 2 days, but I can't eat. My stomach is in knots. Eat, I said gently. You are going to need your strength for what comes next. We sat in silence until the food arrived. Douglas stared at the eggs and hash browns like they were alien objects. Then he picked up his fork and started eating. He ate fast. He ate like a man who didn't know when his next meal was coming. It was heartbreaking to watch. This was the boy I had protected on the playground. This was the brother I had stepped aside for. And now he was reduced to this. When he was finished, he pushed the plate away. He wiped his mouth with a paper napkin and looked at me. The bravado was gone. The anger was gone. There was only fear. Rick, he said, his voice trembling. Thank you for coming. I didn't think you would show up. I took a sip of my coffee. I told you I would meet you, Douglas. I keep my word, unlike some people in this family. He flinched. He knew I was talking about the will. He knew I was talking about the 3 days he gave me to move out. Look, Rick, I know I screwed up. I know I was greedy, but you have made your point. You have humiliated me. You have destroyed me. Pamela is gone. The car is gone. My reputation is gone. Isn't that enough? Can't we just stop this now? He reached across the table, trying to grab my hand. I pulled back. I am not doing this to punish you, Douglas, I said. I am doing this to settle the estate. You have a house that is trespassing on my land. The 30-day clock is ticking. I need to know what your plan is. Douglas laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that made the couple in the next booth look over. My plan. Rick, I am sleeping in a truck. I have a $100,000 lawsuit hanging over my head. Sterling is filing criminal charges on Monday if I don't return his deposit. I don't have a plan. I have a death sentence. He leaned in, lowering his voice. Rick, you have to sign the lease. If you sign the lease, I can close the deal with Sterling. He will drop the lawsuit if the sale goes through. I will pay off the bank. I will walk away with nothing, but at least I won't go to jail. Please, just sign the paper. I reached into my briefcase. I pulled out a document, but it wasn't a lease. Douglas's eyes lit up for a second, then dimmed when he saw the title of the document. Agreement of Sale and Transfer of Personal Property. He looked at me confused. What is this? I clasped my hands on the table. I am not going to sign a lease, Douglas. I am never going to sign a lease with you. You have proven that you cannot be trusted with the land our father protected for 50 years. Douglas started to protest, but I cut him off. However, I am offering you a lifeline. A one-time offer. I will buy the structure from you. I will buy the house, the garage, and every improvement you made. Douglas blinked. You want to buy the house, but you don't have any money. You are on a pension. The house is worth $1.5 million. I shook my head slowly. No, Douglas. The house is worth $1.5 million if it sits on the land. If it has to be moved, it is just a pile of wood and glass. In fact, it is a liability. It costs money to demolish it. Technically, it has a negative value. I tapped the document. But I am generous. I am willing to pay you for the scrap value of the house. Douglas stared at me. How much? I pulled out a cashier's check from my pocket. I laid it on the table face up. The number was printed in stark black ink. $40,000. Douglas looked at the check. Then he looked at me. Then he looked back at the check. His face turned red. 40,000. Are you insane? I spent 50,000 just on the deposit for the Porsche. The kitchen renovation cost 20,000. This is an insult. This is robbery. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. It is not robbery, Douglas. It is math. You owe Sterling $50,000. You probably have about $10,000 left in equity in the truck if you sell it today. This check plus your truck gets you out of the fraud charge. It keeps you out of prison. Douglas slammed his fist on the table. I won't do it. I won't sign. It is my house. I would rather burn it down. I leaned forward. My voice dropped to a whisper hard as granite. If you burn it down, you go to prison for arson. If you don't sign by noon today, I file the eviction order on Monday. The court will force you to remove the house. You can't afford that. So the court will seize the house and give it to me for free to cover your unpaid rent. I paused to let that sink in. You have two choices, Douglas. Choice A, you walk away with $40,000 and your freedom. You start over. You get a job. You live a humble life. Choice B, you hold on to your pride, you go to prison for fraud, and I get the house anyway for $0. Douglas stared at me. He was breathing hard. He looked around the diner as if looking for an exit, but there was no exit from the truth. He looked at the check. It was a lifeline. A thin, fraying rope, but it was the only rope he had. He picked up the document. His hands were shaking so bad the paper rattled. You planned this, he whispered. You planned this from the beginning. You knew I would spend the money. You knew I would trap myself. You watched me drown, and you just waited with a life preserver that cost exactly what you wanted to pay. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. You are the devil, Rick. You are colder than Dad ever was. I took a pen out of my pocket. I clicked it. I set it down next to the paper. I am not the devil, Douglas, and I didn't plan your greed. You did that all on your own. I just read the fine print. He picked up the pen. He hesitated for a long moment. He looked at the signature line. This was it. The end of the Caldwell legacy for him. The end of his dreams of wealth. He signed. It was a messy scrawl, not the flamboyant signature he used to have. He pushed the paper toward me and snatched the check. He stood up. He looked down at me with a mixture of hatred and shame. "One question," he said. "Just tell me the truth. How did you know? How did you know about the land trust?" Dad never told us. I picked up the document. I checked the signature. It was valid. The house was mine. I looked up at him. I thought about the hours I spent in that motel room. I thought about the moment I almost threw the book away. I didn't have a secret source, Douglas. I didn't have a spy. I took a sip of my coffee and looked him dead in the eye. "I just read the Bible, Douglas. I actually read it. Dad left instructions for both of us. He left you the wealth to test your character. He left me the wisdom to test my patience. We both got exactly what we deserved." Douglas stood there for a moment, stunned. He opened his mouth to say something, but closed it. There was nothing left to say. He turned and walked out of the diner. I watched him go. He walked past the window clutching that $40,000 check like it was the Holy Grail. He got into his truck and drove away. I sat there alone in the booth. I finished my coffee. I left a $20 bill on the table for the waitress. I picked up the signed contract. I folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket, right next to the letter from my father. The war was over. The house was safe. I stood up and walked out into the sunlight. For the first time in a month, I was going home. And this time, I didn't need a key. I owned the door. I watched Douglas's truck disappear down the road, a cloud of black exhaust marking his exit from my life. He had his $40,000. It was enough to keep him out of jail, but not enough to keep him in the lifestyle to which he had become addicted. I heard later that he moved to a small town in Oregon, working as a night manager at a storage facility. A fitting end, I thought, for a man who tried to store up treasures on earth, but forgot to pay the rent. I finished my coffee and drove back to Queen Anne Hill. The drive felt different this time. The weight was gone. The anger was gone. There was only a quiet sense of purpose. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood tall and silent against the blue sky. The for sale sign was still there, leaning crookedly in the grass. I walked over to it, pulled it out of the ground, and tossed it into the back of my truck. That was the first act of reclamation. I walked up the steps and unlocked the front door. The inside of the house was cold. It smelled of stale perfume and abandoned dreams. I walked through the living room, past the ghost of the Porsche that was no longer in the driveway, past the spot where the silk curtains used to hang. I went straight to the kitchen. The crack in the ceiling was still there, a jagged reminder of Douglas's arrogance. But it didn't scare me. I knew how to fix it. The next morning, I didn't call a guy from an app. I called a structural engineering firm I had worked with for 20 years. When the crew arrived, they didn't park on the lawn. They wore hard hats. They brought steel beams, not just 2x4s. They treated the house with the respect it deserved. I spent the next 3 months restoring the damage. We lifted the sagging joists. We installed a proper load-bearing header. We didn't cover up the scars with cheap paint. We healed the wounds in the plaster. I stripped the floors myself, sanding away the scuff marks left by Pamela's high heels, bringing the original oak back to life. I didn't modernize the kitchen. I restored it. I brought back the warmth that my mother had loved. I planted a garden in the backyard, right where Douglas had wanted to dig his pool. I planted hydrangeas and roses, roots that would go deep into the soil that now belonged to me in every sense of the word. One evening, after the last contractor had left and the smell of sawdust had been replaced by the smell of brewing coffee, I sat in the living room. The fire was crackling in the hearth. The house was solid. It didn't groan anymore. It felt settled. I picked up the Bible from the coffee table. It was worn, the leather cover still bearing the scar where I had cut it open. I ran my hand over the binding. My father had left me this book not as a consolation prize, but as a map. He knew that Douglas would look at the house and see dollar signs. He knew I would look at the house and see home. I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece. I placed the Bible right in the center, exactly where it had sat for 40 years. It wasn't just a book anymore. It was the deed. It was the title. It was the rock upon which this house was built. I looked out the window at the city lights twinkling below. I was 68 years old. I lived alone, but I wasn't lonely. I had the ground beneath my feet. I had the roof over my head. And most importantly, I had the peace of knowing that some legacies are not given. They are earned. I turned off the lamp and sat in the glow of the fire. The house was mine. From the deep roots in the earth to the chimney reaching for the stars, it was finally, truly mine. I learned that true inheritance is not about the numbers in a bank account. It is about the values buried deep in your bones. Douglas spent his life chasing the shiny exterior of success while ignoring the rotting foundation underneath. My father taught me that the most valuable property you can own is your integrity. It is the only thing that cannot be repossessed by a bank or stolen by a greedy spouse. You cannot build a life on greed and expect it to stand when the storm comes. In the end, the ground beneath your feet is only as solid as the truth you live by. If you enjoyed watching justice be served cold, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to protect your own peace? I read every single comment. See you in the next story.